I always thought I had a solid grasp of my life, my wife, and the world we had created together. The years had unfolded with such predictability that I never questioned it. We had been married for nearly 30 years. In that time, we'd built a home, weathered some challenges, and settled into a life that, though not glamorous, was comfortable. There were no great excitements or disruptions, just the two of us, side by side, navigating the small, steady rhythm of life. Our house, nestled on the edge of town, was modest. Nothing ostentatious or grand about it, but it was home. A small, neat garden out back, a cozy living room where we'd spend quiet evenings, a kitchen where she would prepare the meals I'd come to expect after all these years. The house wasn't large, but it was enough. Just enough for the two of us. We had never wanted children, never felt the need for them. Our lives were ours, and that had always been fine. She worked as a teacher at a local school, a job that gave her purpose and, of course, a steady income. I worked in middle management at a company nearby. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid the bills. We were comfortable, modestly so, but we weren't struggling. Our routine was simple. Every morning, we'd wake up, I'd go off to work, and she'd go to her school. Evenings were spent in the same way: dinner, TV, a bit of quiet conversation, and then sleep. The weekends were often a little more eventful, with trips to the local farmers' market or walks around the neighborhood. Nothing extravagant, but it was enough. At the time, I never doubted that this was how it was supposed to be. This was what life was: stable, dependable, predictable. That was the foundation we had built our lives on. There was nothing spectacular about it, but it was ours. We'd grown older together, and I thought that meant I knew her, knew everything about her, and that our bond was unshakable. Then, one day, she mentioned him. I didn't think much of it at first, but that was the moment everything started to change. She told me, matter-of-factly, that a man from her past would be coming into town. He was an old friend, someone she'd known before me, a childhood sweetheart. They hadn't seen each other in years, but he was reaching out to reconnect. Of course, there was no reason for me to feel uneasy. It was nothing more than two people catching up. They'd had their past, and I had mine. We were adults, and I didn't think for a second that there was anything to worry about. She had always had people from her past drift in and out of her life. This would be no different. But as the days passed, I began to notice small things that, in retrospect, should have alerted me. I didn't think much of them at first. She began spending more time on her phone, texting him more often, stepping away when I entered the room. The casual mentions of him increased, always framed as old memories, or catching up on old times, but I could feel a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't anything overt, nothing blatant that would have raised immediate suspicion. But something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it at first. After all, we had always trusted each other implicitly. She had no reason to betray that trust, and I had no reason to suspect anything untoward. But my gut began to tighten with an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I'd never been a man who questioned things. My life had always been straightforward, and that's how I liked it. I didn't go searching for drama or trouble where there was none. I'd trusted her implicitly, and that trust had always been rewarded. Why would I start doubting her now? Yet, there it was, a nagging feeling that refused to go away. I told myself I was overthinking it, that everything was fine. The phone calls became more frequent. The messages seemed longer, more personal. I noticed her smile more when she spoke about him. And there were the lunches, just the two of them, catching up. Again, nothing to worry about, right? But every time she came home from one of these meetings, there was something different about her. She seemed a little too cheerful, a little too distant. There was a warmth in her voice when she spoke about him, something I hadn't heard before. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just old friends reconnecting. What harm could there be in that? The days passed, and I began to observe more closely, unable to rid myself of the growing sense of unease. There was no hard evidence, no concrete reason to think that anything was wrong. But I couldn't deny the feeling that something was changing. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was as if she was slipping away from me, little by little, as she rekindled a bond with someone from her past. We went about our days as usual, and yet everything felt different. I couldn't place my finger on it, but I felt a disconnect I hadn't felt before. The thing was, I trusted her. I always had. There had been no reason not to. She had always been my partner, my constant. I had no reason to doubt her. But there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't ignore. And though I couldn't yet name it, I felt the change in the air. It was the calm before the storm. And I had no idea how much my life was about to unravel. What was once a steady, predictable existence was beginning to feel like a house built on sand. Over time, I began to notice the changes. Her phone calls, once brief and casual, grew longer, more animated. It wasn't the frequency that caught my attention, but the way she spoke about him, with a softness, a warmth I hadn't heard in years. Even when she spoke about trivial things, there was a light in her eyes, a smile that didn't feel familiar. I tried to push the thoughts aside, convincing myself there was nothing to worry about. They had a history, after all, a shared past from before we met. She often spoke fondly of their childhood memories, and I told myself it was innocent. But as the weeks passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that their connection went beyond nostalgia. One evening, after she returned from seeing him, I felt it more acutely. She was her usual cheerful self, laughing and moving around the house. Yet something had shifted. Her touch felt hesitant, her gaze distant. At dinner, she was present but not fully there, as if part of her mind was somewhere else. The joy in her seemed brighter, lighter, but it wasn't joy I could claim. I couldn't sleep that night. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I wrestled with my thoughts. Was I imagining things? Overreacting? Or was there something real behind the unease that had taken root in my chest? The following week, I stayed home unexpectedly and decided to observe her. As she prepared to leave for another meeting with him, I noticed small but telling details, the extra care she took with her appearance, the way she adjusted her shirt in the mirror. It wasn't for me, of that, I was certain. She left the house with her usual ease, unaware that I watched her go. That evening, she came back glowing. She smiled warmly, told me about their conversation, but there was something guarded in her tone. It wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't say. Her happiness seemed tied to him in a way I couldn't ignore. My suspicion grew until it became impossible to suppress. One evening, after receiving a curt text from her saying she'd be late, I decided to follow my instincts. I drove to the restaurant where they often met, my hands gripping the wheel as I tried to calm the storm in my mind. When I arrived, I saw them through the window. They sat close together, deep in conversation. She leaned toward him, laughing in a way that felt both intimate and effortless. The sparkle in her eyes, the curve of her smile, it was a side of her I hadn't seen in months. And then it happened. She reached across the table, and he took her hand. His fingers curled around hers with a familiarity that left no room for doubt. I sat frozen in the car, staring through the glass. The weight of the moment crushed me. It wasn't just their proximity or the way they laughed together, it was the unspoken intimacy of that touch. A touch that once belonged to me. Driving home, I couldn't see through the haze of emotions, anger, sadness, betrayal. When she came home later, her steps were light, but there was caution in her eyes. She knew, and I knew, and yet neither of us spoke. The woman I had loved, the woman I thought I knew, had become a stranger. And as I sat there in the dark, I realized that the life I believed was ours was slipping through my fingers, and I had no idea how to stop it. The weight of what I had seen that night didn't lift. It clung to me, gnawing at my insides, poisoning every thought. She had betrayed me. She had given herself to him, and I had seen it with my own eyes. The image of their hands entwined, the way her body leaned toward him, the smiles and glances, they all haunted me, replaying over and over, mocking my weakness. The warmth I once felt when I looked at her was gone, replaced with a cold, crushing emptiness. But more than the betrayal, it was the realization that she had hidden this from me for so long that cut the deepest. I had never been the type to act impulsively, to lash out without thinking. But this was different. My life had been turned upside down, and I wasn't the man I used to be. The anger had taken root, and with it came a burning desire for revenge. The days that followed were a blur. I barely spoke to her, barely acknowledged her presence. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was the woman who had deceived me, who had shared herself with someone else. The house felt suffocating, the walls closing in around me as I planned what I needed to do. He was still in the picture, still meeting her, still taking what was once mine. But I knew what had to happen. He couldn't be allowed to continue. No one could. I began to gather what I needed, the tools of revenge. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it felt like the only thing left to do. My mind was clouded with rage, and the thought of confronting him face to face in some quiet, civil manner seemed foolish. No, this had to be different. This had to be final. I had never used a gun before, but I wasn't a fool. I knew how to get one, how to make sure it would be effective. It was a small, simple thing, but it would do the job. I thought about it constantly, where, when, how. I had no doubt in my mind. He would pay. Then, there was her. My wife, the woman I had spent decades with. She was a part of this, too. She had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible, and I couldn't let her off scot-free. She had to understand the weight of her actions, feel the sting of the same betrayal she had inflicted on me. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen from me. I waited for the right moment, for the perfect opportunity to strike. I wasn't sure how long I could keep up the facade, pretending everything was normal, pretending to still be the man she once knew. But it didn't matter. I would keep my silence until the time was right. Then it came, another evening. Another night when he would be there, when she would be with him. I didn't know where exactly, but I knew where they usually went. The same quiet restaurant. The same empty tables. I would be waiting. I arrived early, slipping into the shadows, hidden just enough so I could see them when they walked in. My heart pounded in my chest as the minutes ticked by, the anticipation curling around my throat like a vice. I watched the door, my eyes never leaving it, as I prepared myself. Then, there they were. She stepped in first, smiling that same smile I had seen before, the one that was not for me. He followed closely behind, his presence far too familiar to me now. The sight of them together sent a wave of nausea through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was it. I stood up, adjusting the gun at my side. No one noticed me. I had made sure of that. The noise of the restaurant, the hum of conversation, drowned out my steps. I was a ghost, moving silently, unnoticed. I walked toward them, slow and deliberate. When they finally saw me, it was too late. He didn't even have time to react before I pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and final. There was no hesitation in my movement, no second thoughts. He crumpled, a look of disbelief etched on his face as he fell to the ground, lifeless. Her scream was the only sound that pierced the air. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was the sound of realization, of horror at what had just happened. She looked at me, her face pale and stunned, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in years. Regret. Fear. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. I turned toward her, the gun still clutched tightly in my hand, my heart pounding as the adrenaline surged through me. She stood frozen, her body trembling, her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She had no words left. I took a step toward her, my voice low and calm, though my insides were churning. "You thought you could have both of us," I said, my tone cold. "You thought you could deceive me, use me, and I wouldn't notice. But I saw everything. And now, you'll understand what it feels like to lose everything." She opened her mouth as if to protest, to beg for mercy, but I didn't give her the chance. I had waited for this moment. And now, it was time to make her feel the same pain she had inflicted on me. I moved closer, watching her with eyes that had long since abandoned love and replaced it with something far darker. I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward me with a force that left her no room to resist. She was weak, trembling under my touch. The fear in her eyes was palpable, but it wasn't enough. It didn't satisfy me. It wasn't enough to erase the years of betrayal, the hollow emptiness I felt inside. "I gave you everything," I whispered, my grip tightening. "And this is how you repay me?" She couldn't answer. She couldn't speak. She was paralyzed by her own guilt, by the consequences of what she had done. But it didn't matter. She had broken me. And now, it was my turn to break her. The silence that followed was deafening, and as I looked down at her, the world around me seemed to fade away. There was no going back now. I had crossed a line, and there was no way to undo the damage. The finality of it all settled in. I had done it. I had taken what was mine. And I would never be the man I was before. The air in the restaurant was thick with tension, heavy and suffocating. The once lively space had become a tomb, the flickering light overhead casting long, grim shadows over the scene. I stood there, the gun still clutched tightly in my hand, my pulse a steady thrum in my ears. My body was rigid, frozen in place, as the gravity of what had just happened began to settle around me like a suffocating blanket. She stood across from me, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had been the center of my world, once. Now, she was just another woman who had betrayed me, another piece of the life I had worked so hard to build, now shattered beyond recognition. The weight of her actions hung over us, thick and oppressive. Her betrayal, her decision to share herself with another man, was now laid bare before me. The very woman who had promised to be with me for better or worse had chosen someone else, someone who was not me. The betrayal wasn't just a violation of trust, it was a violation of everything we had built, of every moment we had shared. The love I had once felt for her had withered and died, replaced by something far darker and far more powerful. She did not speak, but her presence was enough. The cold look in her eyes, the tremble in her hands, told me everything I needed to know. She knew what she had done. She knew there was no turning back. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. She had made her choice, and now, she would face the consequences. I turned my back to her, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't need to look at her anymore. There was nothing left to say. The pain of her betrayal had been raw and jagged when I first discovered it, but now it had transformed into something else, something colder, more calculated. The gun in my hand felt heavy, but it no longer felt foreign. It felt like an extension of the rage that had consumed me, like the tool of justice in my hands. The only justice I had left to claim. As I walked toward the door, I felt a flicker of movement behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I could feel her presence, the weight of her gaze burning into my back. But I had no intention of stopping. The path I had set for myself was clear, and I would not let anything or anyone divert me from it. I had done what needed to be done, and now, I would leave it all behind. The silence that followed was suffocating. It pressed in on me, yet I didn't feel the weight of regret or guilt that might have consumed another man. No, for me, it was liberation. The heavy burden of betrayal had been lifted from my shoulders, and now I was free. Free from her lies. Free from the life we had built together. Free from the man who had taken what was mine. It was an unsettling freedom, but it was mine nonetheless. I stepped out into the night, the cool air filling my lungs, grounding me in the reality of what had just transpired. The city around me felt distant, as if I were moving through a dream, disconnected from everything I once knew. But that didn't matter. All that mattered was that I had taken control. I had finally made my move, and now the pieces of my shattered life had begun to fall back into place. The events of the night replayed in my mind, each moment seared into my memory. The gunshot. His fall. Her scream. The finality of it all. I had claimed my revenge. But even as the taste of it lingered, something deep inside me knew that I would never be the same. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity. The rage that had consumed me was fading, replaced by something else. A cold satisfaction. A sense of closure. I had done what I needed to do, and now it was time to walk away. There was no going back to who I had been, and I wouldn't try. I had faced the truth of what she had done, and in doing so, I had reclaimed a piece of myself. The love I had once felt for her was gone, replaced by a deep, unyielding sense of finality. The man I was had died with her betrayal, but in his place stood something new. Something street. As I walked away from the place where it all began, I knew that whatever came next, I would face it head-on. There was no fear in me now. There was only the cold, unrelenting truth of what I had done, and the certainty that I would never allow myself to be broken again. I had taken my revenge. I had done what needed to be done. And now, the world would have to reckon with the man I had become.